So I had written a couple of songs before the 6-year-old song, which was actually because my auditorium teacher.
For 60 years, his falsetto has been the soundtrack to our heartbreaks and our honeymoons. But at 85, Smokey Robinson is finally tired of the riddles. The man who wrote The Tracks of My Tears has spent a lifetime hiding behind the velvet curtain of Motown's polished image. Now, the mask is coming off. He's finally naming the one person who truly owned his heart, a moment of honesty that finally settles the debt between his private life and his public lyrics. Time to unfold who that actual love of his life is. Beyond the songbook, the secret we shared. The world always assumed Smokey Robinson wrote about a feeling, an abstract ghost of romance that haunted his high notes. But for years, the truth was sitting right across the aisle in the Motown offices, or perhaps in the recording booth next door. When Smokey finally spoke the name Diana Ross in the context of his life's great love, the earth beneath the music industry shifted. It wasn't just a casual fling, it was a profound, complicated connection that lasted over half a decade, while both were ascending to the peak of global superstardom. To understand why this confession carries such weight at 85, you have to understand the environment of Detroit in the early 60s. Motown wasn't just a company, it was a pressurized greenhouse where young, beautiful, and immensely talented people were kept in close quarters, told how to walk, how to talk, and who to be. Smokey was the golden boy, the married man, and the vice president. Diana was the rising queen. Their attraction wasn't just physical. It was a meeting of two souls who understood the specific, terrifying weight of being the face of black excellence in a divided America. But this revelation isn't a simple fairy tale. It's a story of the one that got away, while he was standing right next to the one he stayed with. For years, fans speculated that his lyrics were inspired by his first wife, Claudette. And while Claudette was his rock, Smokey has finally admitted that the fire and ice he sang about was often fueled by his clandestine relationship with Ross. This wasn't a secret born of malice, but of a timing that was perpetually out of sync. They were two icons moving in the same direction, but bound by different destinies. The depth of this actual love lies in the secrecy itself. Imagine being the man who wrote the world's greatest love songs, only to realize your own greatest muse is someone you cannot publicly claim. Every time Smokey watched the Supremes take the stage, he wasn't just watching a label mate. He was watching a woman who knew the man behind the Smokey persona. He has described their bond as something that transcended the physical, a soul tie that complicated his marriage and his professional life. It was a love that existed in the stolen moments between tour dates and late-night studio sessions, away from the prying eyes of Berry Gordy and the tabloid press. When we look at his discography now, through the lens of this 85-year-old's honesty, the songs change. Ooh, Baby Baby feels less like a plea for forgiveness and more like a confession of a double life. The Tears of a Clown weren't just about a breakup. The songs change. He wore every time he stepped into the Motown foyer and had to treat the love of his life like a mere colleague. It's a heavy burden to carry for 60 years. Smokey's decision to finally be transparent about Diana Ross isn't about chasing headlines. It's about clearing his conscience before the final curtain call. This confession also forces us to look at the collateral damage. Love, in its most actual and raw form, is rarely tidy. By admitting that Diana was the one who held that specific, untouchable part of his heart, he acknowledges the complexity of his marriage to Claudette. It's a relatable human struggle. The conflict between the person you are supposed to love and the person you simply do. At 85, Smokey is no longer interested in the supposed two. He's interested in the truth of the heartbeat. The relationship eventually ended because of the impossible logistics of their lives. Diana's star was becoming a sun that eclipsed everything else, and Smokey was tied to the infrastructure of Motown and his family. They chose the music over the muse. But, as he looks back now, he recognizes that while he lived a full life, fathered children, and built an empire, that specific spark with Ross was the actual love. the one that defined his interior world. It was the secret engine behind the melodies that defined a generation. By naming her, he isn't diminishing his other relationships, he's contextualizing them. He's explaining why there was always a certain melancholy in his voice, even in the upbeat tracks. It was the sound of a man who had everything, yet was always missing a piece of himself that stayed with a girl from the Brewster Douglas housing projects. This revelation serves as a bridge to his past. It explains the intensity of the Motown era, a time when passion wasn't just a marketing tool, but the literal fuel for the hits. Smokey and Diana were the secret architects of the Motown sound because they were living the lyrics they were recording. Their shared history is a tapestry of late-night phone calls, hidden glances in the wings of the Apollo Theater, and the quiet understanding that they were changing the world together, even if they couldn't be together. As he reflects on this at 85, there is a sense of peace in his voice. The actual love of his life isn't a scandal to him anymore, it's a treasure. It's the proof that he lived, that he felt, and that he was human behind the hits. For the audience, it's a reminder that even our idols have tracks of tears that we never see until they are ready to show us. The weight of it on a single topic allows us to sit with the discomfort of his honesty. It wasn't just a crush, it was a tectonic shift in his personal geography. To be Smokey Robinson is to be the poet of a century, and a poet's greatest work is always his own life. By confessing this love now, he has finished the poem. He has closed the loop on a mystery that spanned 6 decades, leaving us to listen to his music with entirely new ears. We aren't just hearing a song, we're hearing the echo of a secret that finally found its way home. The transition from this intense, secret passion to his domestic life is where the story gets even more human. Because as much as Diana Ross was the lightning bolt, Claudette was the ground. And the friction between the lightning and the ground is what created the storm of his career. It leads us directly into the next phase of his journey, the years where he tried to balance the actual love with the official one, and the cost that balance took on his soul. While the fire he shared with Diana Ross burned in secret, it was the steady, visible flame of his marriage to Claudette that provided the world with the image of Motown's first family, even as the foundation began to crack under the weight of his hidden heart. The Miracle Years, Claudette, and the Cost of Fame. Before the world knew him as a solo icon, Smokey Robinson was the heartbeat of a group, and his world revolved around its only female member. Claudette Rogers wasn't just a backup singer in The Miracles, she was the girl next door turned queen of the soul circuit. If the secret fire he held for others was the lightning bolt that struck in the dark, Claudette was the very earth he walked on every single day. She was the one who was there when they were traveling in a cramped, rattling bus through the segregated South, sharing cold sandwiches and warm dreams of one day playing the Apollo. Their marriage in 1959 was supposed to be the foundational myth of the Motown empire, the perfect union of 2 rising stars who found each other before the money, the madness, and the billboards arrived. But being the perfect couple of a cultural revolution is a heavy cross to carry. As Smokey ascended to become the vice president of Motown and the label's most prolific songwriter, the demands on his time became a physical wall between him and his wife. While he was locked in the studio crafting hits for the Temptations or Mary Wells, Claudette was often left holding the pieces of a domestic life that felt increasingly hollow. The public saw the glamorous photos, the sharp silk suits, the matching stage outfits, and the effortless smiles. But behind the scenes, the miracle was beginning to feel like a grueling, lonely marathon. Smokey was the poet laureate of Black America, but at home, he was often a ghost. The most painful chapter of this era wasn't the grueling tour schedule or the price of fame, but the personal tragedies that occurred away from the microphones. Smokey and Claudette suffered through 7 devastating miscarriages. For a man who could command an audience of thousands with a single honeyed note, the inability to protect his wife from this recurring grief was a profound source of helplessness. It deepened the rift in a way that no hit record could repair. While Smokey buried his pain in his work, writing some of the most heart-wrenching songs in history during this period, the distance between them grew. He was becoming the world's greatest translator of love, while the love in his own home was being tested by an unrelenting fire. Eventually, through the help of a surrogate, they welcomed their children, Barry and Tamla, On the surface, it seemed like the breakthrough the family needed to heal. But by then, the actual love he harbored for the muses of his past had already carved out a permanent place in Smokey's psyche. He was a man divided. He lived a life of duty and deep, genuine affection for Claudette, the woman who had seen his struggle from the dirt up, but his creative and romantic spirit was often elsewhere. This part of his life is a masterclass in the complexity of human loyalty. It asks the question, how do you stay fully devoted to the person who stood by you in the trenches when your heart has already wandered to the mountain peak? The industry pressured them to maintain the image at all costs. Motown's famous Charm School didn't just teach artists how to hold a teacup or walk across a stage, it taught them how to curate a persona that was palatable to a global audience. Smokey and Claudette were the anchors of that respectability. If they failed, the image of the clean-cut, sophisticated Motown family would fail with them, so they played the part with professional precision. Smokey wrote, "You've really got a hold on me," and the world assumed it was just another catchy pop song. In reality, it was a reflection of the internal tug-of-war he was experiencing. A man held captive by his history, his mounting responsibilities, and a wandering heart that he couldn't quite reel back in. As the 60s turned into the 70s, the strain of the dual life became undeniable. Smokey eventually made the shocking decision to retire from the miracles to spend more time at home, hoping that stepping off the road would fix the cracks in the foundation. But you cannot fix a spiritual gap with mere physical presence. The miracle years were fading into a bittersweet, sepia-toned memory. Claudette eventually retired from the stage entirely, choosing a life of quiet privacy, while Smokey remained tethered to the relentless neon of the spotlight. The divergence of their souls was complete. What makes this period so relatable is the sheer, messy humanity of the failure. It wasn't that they didn't love each other. It was that the love was being asked to carry too much weight for too long. It had to survive the pressure of a global empire, the crushing grief of repeated loss, and the secret presence of another woman in the back of Smokey's mind. When they finally divorced in 1986, it wasn't a sudden, violent explosion, but rather the final, exhausted exhale of a long-held breath. At 85, Smokey looks back at the Claudette years with a mix of deep reverence and honest regret. He acknowledges her as the woman who made him a man and the one who bore the brunt of his meteoric rise. But he also realizes that his heart was never truly singular. The miracle was simply that they lasted as long as they did under the weight of his truth. By the time the marriage ended, Smokey was entering a new, darker chapter, one where the lack of an anchor would lead him into a storm of addiction that almost silenced his legendary voice forever. But as his domestic world collapsed, Smokey sought refuge in a brotherhood that would prove even more resilient than his marriages. The Berry Gordy Brotherhood and the Motown Machine. While the romantic fires of Smokey's life were often turbulent, there was one relationship that remained the North Star of his entire existence. To talk about the love of Smokey Robinson's life without mentioning Berry Gordy is to miss the architecture of his soul. This wasn't a romance in the traditional sense, but it was a platonic soulmate bond that built an empire. Gordy was the ambitious visionary with a boxer's grit, and Smokey was the skinny kid with the green eyes and a notebook full of poems. Together, they didn't just make music, they manufactured a brand of magic that integrated a segregated America. Their brotherhood was forged in the basement of a house on West Grand Boulevard, Hitsville, USA. Smokey was the first person to truly believe in Gordy's dream of a black-owned record label that could compete with the white giants of the industry. In those early days, love looked like staying up until dawn, arguing over the hook of a song or the timing of a snare hit. Gordy pushed Smokey to be more than a singer. He groomed him to be the vice president of the company. It was a level of trust rarely seen in the cutthroat music business. Gordy wasn't just Smokey's boss, he was his mentor, his brother, and his protector. This professional love affair was the actual constant in Smokey's life for over 60 years. While marriages began and ended, and while secret muses drifted in and out of his periphery, Berry Gordy was always there. When Smokey felt he couldn't write another note, Gordy was the one who challenged him to find a new perspective. When the pressures of the civil rights movement and the changing social landscape of the 60s threatened to overwhelm them, they leaned on each other. It was a partnership built on the shared understanding that they were doing something larger than themselves. They were creating a legacy that would outlive their physical bodies. However, the Motown machine was a demanding mistress. The love Smokey felt for the label and for Gordy often came at the expense of his own peace of mind. The machine required perfection. It required Smokey to be a songwriter for everyone else, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, the Four Tops, before he could be a songwriter for himself. This selfless devotion to the collective success of Motown is perhaps the greatest act of love in Smokey's career. He gave his best melodies away to ensure the brotherhood survived. He sacrificed his own solo aspirations for years to make sure the Motown sound was an unbreakable wall of hits. As the years rolled on, this bond was tested by the relocation of the company to Los Angeles and the eventual sale of the label. Many artists felt betrayed by Gordy's decisions during the transition, but Smokey remained the loyalist. His love for Barry was rooted in a deep sense of gratitude that transcended business. He knew that without Gordy, the poet laureate might have just been another kid on a Detroit street corner with a dream. At 85, when Smokey speaks of those years, his eyes light up not just for the music, but for the camaraderie. It was a time when they were young, gifted, and black, and they owned the world. The brotherhood also served as a shield. In the high-stakes world of the 60s, being a black superstar meant living with a target on your back. Gordy created they shared the weight of the fame that threatened to crush them. Center of that sanctuary. They shared the weight of the fame that threatened to crush them. When Smokey speaks of actual love today, he often circles back to this sense of belonging. The Motown family was a real family, with all the dysfunction and devotion that implies. And at the head of the table were two men who had started with nothing but an $800 loan and a belief in each other. Even when Smokey's personal life was in shambles, the brotherhood held. When his marriage to Claudette ended and his secret affair with Ross became a memory, he still had a desk at Motown and a brother in Barry. It was the one place where he didn't have to wear the clown mask. With Gordy, he could just be Bill Robinson, the nickname only his inner circle used. This level of intimacy is rare in any life, let alone one lived under the magnifying glass of global fame. It was the bedrock that allowed him to survive the highs and the lows. Ultimately, the Motown machine was the vehicle, but the brotherhood was the engine. As Smokey reflects on his 85 years, he acknowledges that the love he poured into that company and that friendship was the most consistent investment of his life. It was a love that didn't demand he choose between duty and desire. It simply demanded that he be great. And in that demand, Smokey found his purpose. But even the strongest brotherhood couldn't protect him from the internal demons that began to surface as he moved away from the structure of the label and into the solitary world of his own struggles. But the safety of the studio couldn't shield him from an internal collapse that turned his golden years into a desperate fight for survival. The dark night of the soul, addiction and redemption. By the mid-80s, the golden boy of Motown was fading into a gray shadow of himself. To the outside world, Smokey Robinson was an untouchable legend, but inside, the poet was silent. This was the period when the masks he had worn for decades, the perfect husband, the corporate executive, the effortless superstar, finally crumbled. In their place came a new, terrifying obsession that threatened to be the final love of his life: crack, harmful substance. It is a jarring chapter for a man whose image was built on such pristine romantic elegance, but it is the most crucial part of his 85-year journey toward the truth. The descent wasn't overnight. It began as the structure of his life started to dissolve. His marriage to Claudette was ending. The Motown empire he helped build was changing shape, and the secret passions of his youth had left him feeling spiritually hollow. Smokey has often described this time as a walking death. The man who had articulated the nuances of the human heart for millions could no longer navigate his own. He retreated from the spotlight, his skin sallow and his famous green eyes losing their spark. The addiction wasn't just a physical craving, it was a symptom of a man who had spent too long living for everyone else's expectations. For 2 years, the king of Motown was a prisoner in his own home. He wasn't writing songs, he was chasing a high that promised to numb the pain of a lifetime of suppressed emotions. It was a period of profound isolation where the actual love of his life wasn't a person at all, but a substance that promised peace and delivered only destruction. This is the dark night of the soul that many fans forget when they look at his polished legacy. But for Smokey, It was the fire that refined him. He had to hit a bottom so low that no amount of fame or money could pull him out. The turning point came not from a rehab clinic or a high-priced doctor, but from a spiritual intervention. Smokey often recounts the story of a woman in a storefront church who looked into his soul and told him that God wasn't finished with him yet. It was a moment of raw, unvarnished grace. In that instant, he realized that the love he had been searching for in women, in fame, and in the bottle was actually a spiritual void that only a higher power could fill. He quit cold turkey, a feat he attributes entirely to divine intervention, and he hasn't touched a substance since 1986. This redemption era brought a new kind of love into his life. Frances Glandney. If Claudette was his youth and Diana was his muse, Frances became his sanctuary. They married in 2002, and she has been the steady hand that guided him into his 80s. This wasn't the volatile, secret passion of his 30s, but a mature, grounded partnership. Frances didn't marry the Smokey of the stage. She married the man who had survived the wreckage of his own life. She represents the actual love of his late stage, a love built on transparency, health, and a shared quietude that the Motown years never allowed. Smokey's survival of the 80s is perhaps his greatest hit. It transformed him from a pop star into a survivor. When he speaks now about the love of his life, there is a weight to his words that wasn't there in the 60s. He understands that love is a choice you make every morning, especially the choice to love yourself enough to stay alive. His redemption allowed him to return to the stage with a voice that was remarkably preserved, a miracle in its own right, after the damage he had done to his body. The dark night also allowed him to mend the fences he had broken. He found a way to be a better father to his children and a more honest friend to those he had pushed away during his addiction. He stopped being a clown and started being a man. The honesty we see from him today, the willingness to talk about his affairs, his failures, and his deepest regrets, is a direct result of this period. You don't survive a descent into hell without coming back with a commitment to the truth. At 85, this chapter of his life serves as the bridge between the myth and the man. It reminds us that even the most beautiful voices have to scream in the dark sometimes. Smokey Robinson didn't just age into a legend, he fought his way there. The redemption he found wasn't just about getting sober. It was about finally being comfortable in his own skin, without the need for a hit record or a secret romance to validate his existence. He found the love he was always writing about, but he found it in the one place he had never looked, the mirror. Having survived the fire, Smokey now stands in the sunset of his career, ready to harmonize his past secrets with his final legacy. The Poet Laureate's final note. At 85, Smokey Robinson possesses a clarity that only comes when the noise of fame finally settles. He no longer looks like a man carrying the heavy burden of Motown's secrets. Instead, he carries the air of a man who has finally exhaled. The revelation regarding the actual love of his life, a title shared by the muse that inspired his hits, the brother who built his stage, and the spiritual peace that saved his soul, is the final piece of a puzzle he has been assembling for nearly a century. He is no longer just a voice on a record, he is a living testament to the endurance of the human heart. The legacy of Smokey Robinson isn't merely found in the gold records or the induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It is found in the way he redefined black masculinity and vulnerability for a global audience. Before Smokey, the leading man was expected to be a pillar of stoicism. Smokey arrived with a falsetto that could pierce a cloud and lyrics that admitted to crying, begging, and breaking. By being honest about his actual love now, he is performing his final act of vulnerability. He is telling his fans that the man they worshipped was just as lost, just as passionate, and just as conflicted as they are. This late-stage honesty has changed the way we hear his music. When The Tracks of My Tears plays today, we don't just hear a clever metaphor. We hear the autobiography of a man who lived behind a mask while the world cheered for the costume. His legacy is the realization that life is not a straight line of happily ever afters, but a messy, overlapping series of devotions. He loved Claudette for the history, Diana for the heat, Barry for the dream, and Frances for the peace. Each was the love of his life for the version of Smokey that existed at that time. His journey from the street corners of Detroit to the pinnacle of global influence, through the valley of addiction, and back into the light, offers a relatable roadmap for anyone seeking redemption. He has proven that it is never too late to speak your truth or to change your tune. As he stands on stage today, his voice remains an anomaly, a silver thread that hasn't been frayed by age or the hard living of his middle years. It is a gift he treats with reverence, a tool he uses to remind us that romance is the only thing that truly lasts. Robinson's life is his greatest poem. It is a work of art that required 85 years of editing, several painful rewrites, and a final, shocking reveal to be complete. He has moved beyond the miracle and the machine to become a singular entity, a man at peace with his past. As the final notes of his career play out, he leaves us with a profound lesson. The actual love of your life isn't just a person you find, but the truth you finally stop running from. The poet of Motown has finally closed his notebook, leaving us with a truth as timeless as his melodies. Subscribe now to stay tuned for more deep dives into legendary celebrity lives.